Okay, so that title is maybe a little dramatic. I didn't rig an election, I didn't subvert democracy in the legislative branch, and I didn't do anything that would affect the real world. All I did personally was manipulate a vote to get the outcome I wanted. For a few of them. Specifically, my members' choice polls and the 3 community votes I held at the end of last year. See, for those who aren't aware, on my channel we frequently dip our toes into the democratic process here. Every month I allow my channel members to pick one topic for me to make a video on, and I even graciously allow the unpaying peasants, I mean community members, to participate through something I call a horde vote. Back in November, as a donathon reward, I opened up 3 polls to my entire community. Anyone could vote if they wanted to, there was no paywall or anything like that, but it was just a bit time consuming. In addition to my regular members' choice polls, community members would get to vote for 1 video topic to be made, 1 deceased members' choice topic to return to the polls, and 3 emotes to be made for the channel. However, I fear I have not been entirely honest with all of you throughout this process. These were never, in fact, meant to gather the pure desires of my community members. They may have incidentally achieved that, but the goal was to prove a couple key points, all of which revolve around how easy it is to make something look democratic, when in actuality it just helps to affirm a decision you want it to get. This plan stretches back years, all the way back to when I first started doing members' choice polls. And in all that time, there's always been one comment that stuck with me. I don't even know if I can find it anymore. If I can, I'll put it on screen, but I remember the sentiment. An accusation of creating a pay-to-win democracy. And they were correct. It just goes so much deeper than they expected. So here's what we're going to do with this video. I will break down how I've used structural incentives to steer these votes towards the outcomes I wanted through manipulative framing, structural manipulation, and putting an unfair finger on the scale in favor of certain outcomes. And maybe, just maybe, you'll start to see how those same techniques get used in the real world. How electoral systems, government messaging, paper candidates, and more can be used to serve a bigger picture and affect how you see things, even when you think you're doing democracy. So, let's get into how to rig a vote and get away with it. Starting with Part 1. The members' choice polls. So, structurally, the way that these have worked has changed a bit over the years, so we're going to go through the basics of it. Starting in April of 2023, I opened up channel memberships on my channel for $5 a month. Members only really got one unique perk. They got to participate in a first-past-the-post winner-take-all vote between 4 topics, with the poll starting on the 1st and ending on the 10th of the month. The topic with the most votes would get made. Second place would return the following month, third would return the month after that, and fourth would return the month after that. In that first month, somewhat hilariously, only a single person joined, so I only had 1 voter, which made it pretty easy. Future polls had more voters than that, but it remained a 4-way first-past-the-post vote until August, at which point it got up to 5 topics per poll briefly before dropping back down to 4 for September and October. This is the electoral system that those of us living in Canada, the US, the UK, and a lot of other countries will recognize. Throughout this period, I kind of informally had a system for deciding if a topic looked like it was too unpopular to get made, although that would also eventually change. November 2023 saw the first big change-up, moving to 5 topics and a 2-round voting system. The top 2 topics after the first 7 days would go head-to-head for 3 more days, with the winner being the topic that got made. This is actually the most commonly used system for electing heads of state in the world, with 87 countries using it for those elections compared to only 22 that use first-past-the-post voting like in the States. Outside of electing presidents, it is a fairly rarely used system owing to the just logistical hurdles that it imposes by forcing every election to functionally be run twice. But it is still used in around a dozen countries in some form or another. For my predominantly American audience, certain US states also use it in a couple of forms, although in kind of a weird way owing to their uniquely strong 2-party system. 7 states, Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and Texas, require candidates to win their primary by a majority vote, and if they fail to do so, then the primary has to become a runoff. North Carolina allows them, but only if the second-place candidate requests it, and only if the first-place candidate receives less than 30% of the vote. In South Dakota, runoffs are triggered whenever no candidate gets more than 35% of the vote with at least 3 candidates running. Again, these are just for primaries, because again, in the US, that's a fair bit of the election. They don't really tend to have second or third parties, I guess, that would really compete against them in the general. But that doesn't mean they don't use them for any generals. In Georgia, for example, they require a runoff whenever none of the candidates in the race get a majority of the vote, whereas in Louisiana, the generals are technically treated as primary races, and in Mississippi, they're triggered if nobody in a statewide race gets a majority. Washington and California do something similar to Louisiana with what's called a jungle primary, where all candidates from all parties compete in a single primary, with the top 2 advancing to the general even if they're both from the same party. Alaska does something kind of weird here, where they do a jungle primary, but then the top 4 candidates will advance to a ranked ballot, and that's for later. For our purposes, though, the best system to look at is France, because France uses it for basically everything. France's version gives the win to anyone who gets an outright majority of the vote with at least 25% turnout, but If that condition isn't met, then the top 2 candidates plus any others who get a vote total greater than 12.5% of registered voters will all get to advance. This means that, in theory, 7 candidates could all advance to the second round. Not 8, because it needs to be greater than 12.5%, not just exactly 12.5%. Well, I don't think they've ever had 7. Their most recent legislative election saw them split heavily between a lot of different parties, and they ended up with 306 out of 577 races going to a 3-way runoff, and an additional 5 going to a 4-way runoff. The problem there is that the runoff is still a winner-take-all race, so in order to prevent the fascist Ralliement National from winning seats from split votes, the centrist Ensemble and the leftist Nouveau Front Populaire candidates frequently stepped down if they weren't in the top 2. Starting in January 2024, I added a point system to this, where topics would get 2 points for placing second, 3 for third, 4 for fourth, and 5 for fifth, and would be eliminated from future polls if they accumulated 10 points total and didn't make it to the runoff of a given month. Community members and channel members alike would be able to see how many points each topic had at this point. Up to this point, the voting was hosted just through members-only messages on YouTube community posts, but starting in October of 2024, I opened up a Patreon and allowed people to become members there instead. In November of 2024, YouTube started doing this really cool and fun thing without telling anyone in advance, where they only allowed 4 topics instead of 5, so I kind of haphazardly had to run it through a Google form instead that month. And in December, I overhauled the whole thing into the system I've used ever since. 4 topics per poll, and instead of 1 member, 1 vote, members instead get to rank their choices from 1 to 4, with 4 being their least favorite topic and 1 being their favorite. This sort of ranked voting thing is used in some US states, has historically been used in some Canadian provinces, and is currently used in places like Australia to elect members to their lower house. The only changes since then have come in March 2025 when I stopped showing people how many points each topic had, and in May 2025 when I added in a horde vote where the entire community at large collectively casted 1 vote for a topic in a public poll on YouTube. Now, the reason I'm going into the nitty-gritty of this is that we kind of went through an interesting electoral evolution here. Initially, it was first past the post voting between 4 or 5 topics. However, if you know anything about electoral systems, you know that's one of the most inefficient formats for actually getting a democratic result that reflects the will of the people. Across the 8 polls I ran with this format, only 1 of them actually resulted in a topic getting majority support: Overwatch 2's weird relationship with representation. The rest won with what's called a plurality, a situation where 1 candidate gets the most votes but less than a majority. This has been a perpetual grievance of mine when people confuse these two if you've ever watched me play Your Turn to Die, Death Game by Majority, where it's never really a death game by majority, but we do not have time for that here. In November 2024, I changed the system to a 2-round vote with the intention there being to work around the system. YouTube doesn't allow for ranked choice, so I had to make do, and a 2-round vote felt pretty workable. And overall, it mostly was. There were a handful of times where the topic with the most votes in the first round lost in the second, and there were a couple times where there were ties, but by and large, the outcomes were pretty consistent, and people were mostly happy with it, I think. However, it's in that 2-round voting system where we can see the first big example of how a vote can be rigged. See, people have 2 biases that can be manipulated here: popularity bias and recency bias. Popularity bias is something we'll get to in a sec, but for recency bias, we're just talking about how people are more likely to gravitate towards a new option simply because it's newer, or be more preferential to the thing they were most recently introduced to. For our purposes, recency bias means 2 things. If I wanted a specific new topic to win, then I would have to try and capitalize on recency bias relative to the other topics. If I wanted a specific older topic to win, I would have to try and make sure that any new topics introduced that month just weren't as appealing, so that recency bias wouldn't work in their favor. And frankly, there were some members' choice topics that were kind of just there to fill a slot. Sue me, it's hard to sometimes think of that many topics every month. What's more though, this also allowed me to focus on splitting the vote. See, for a long time, this was an Overwatch heavy channel. However, I also like to throw in some oddball videos about other topics, videos about other genres or other media that didn't really fit the mold on my channel, but which I said I was putting in there to see if my audience was interested in diversifying things a little bit, just giving us some new options. Fact of the matter is, I already knew they were, or wanted them to be, and I just wanted an excuse to get into it. For a long time, a lot of my polls would be all Overwatch except for 1 topic. And wouldn't you know it, all those Overwatch topics just kept on losing. Weird. I guess my audience just doesn't want Overwatch content as much anymore. At least that's how I framed it. In reality, I was splitting the Overwatch vote deliberately to manufacture consent for changing my channel's direction. I knew I could rely on a relatively small but very active part of my community who, watched my streams and heard about how many thoughts I had about Buried Stars or Your Turn to Die or Spike Chunsoft games or Danganronpa or Drag Race or Resource Extraction or Time Loops or whatever else to be proactive participants and largely vote as a block in favor of those oddball topics. By contrast, the rest of my Overwatch-focused audience would typically split their vote across 3 or 4 Overwatch topics, functionally guaranteeing that the oddball topics would win during the first past the post phase, and guaranteeing that they make the runoff once that change happened. What's more, I knew that the people who really wanted a Deathloop video or a V3 video or a Buried Stars video would be far more likely to actually show up for the runoff vote and support their topic, whereas the Overwatch voters were more likely to not be motivated because their first round pick got eliminated. and they just tended to also be less invested members. This is not any shade to any part of my audience, to be very clear. It's just that the Overwatch contingency has always been a more casual component of my audience relative to fans of the other stuff. For most of 2024, non-Overwatch topics kept winning, which was aided by the fact that the Inescapable video had done so well and brought in more fans of other, visual novel content. But people tend to kind of forget that the month before that, I'd put out an Overwatch video that had absolutely cleaned the fuck up. And it had even been a member's choice video. It wasn't like the appetite for Overwatch content suddenly disappeared from me, but it sure looked like it had if you just looked at the results of those votes. The move to Google Forms changed a lot, though. For one, the results were now anonymous and hidden. While the votes were on YouTube, everyone who was a member could see how the other members had voted. And after I added Patreon to the mix, I would manually update a total vote count on both platforms to try and help keep it fair. This brought popularity bias into the mix, and coupled with knowing how close each topic was to elimination, it's kind of a big deal. When people were warned in advance that a topic was at risk of elimination, if it placed below a certain threshold, they tended to vote for it more. Popularity bias would skew people in favor of topics that were already popular, and for a while I used to joke that whoever got the first vote in would almost always get their topic to the end because people would gravitate towards what was already provably popular. People don't like to lose things, so if you threaten to take something away, they're more likely to, support it. By moving to Google Forms, I was losing the ability to manipulate popularity bias in favor of topics I liked, but I traded it off by getting rid of that fear of losing something bias that probably has a real name that I don't know, but, that bias was inconvenient for me. That was worth trading out. I wanted topics to get eliminated so I could refresh the list with new stuff, usually. On the flip side, I also didn't want topics that I liked to be at risk of losing and getting eliminated. And that's where ranked voting comes in clutch. See, the way it works now is that a topic only gets eliminated if it didn't place at least second at any point in the ranked counting or in preference. And in terms of preference, I mean like every number 1 vote was worth 4 points, number 2 votes are worth 2, number 3s are worth 1, and number 4s are worth nothing. And I tally all those up and see, which one has the most preference towards it. If a topic takes at least second in terms of pure votes or preference at any point, it can't be eliminated. Hence why topics that I liked with relatively niche appeal, like the Buried Star social media toxicity one, got to hang around for literally an entire year before eventually it ended up being a favorable matchup. The only way for something to get eliminated is for it to be genuinely unwanted. And I have a pretty good sense for what you guys want by now. And occasionally, I'll throw in a clear weak topic just to make it a bit easier to skew a vote in my favor. Why Blizzard's cosmetics surveys are inherently flawed is a subject that I do find interesting, and I think I could make a good video out of it, but I knew with a title and thumbnail like that, there was no hope that it was ever going to win. And by implementing more barriers to voting, even relatively easy to overcome ones like a very small fee or having to go to another website for it, I further disincentivized the more moderate voters, while the supporters of the more niche topics were more likely to power through and keep going. That's also true of the real world. Every barrier put up to prevent people from voting will only help more radical parties and politicians most of the time, because unless the barrier specifically prevents those people from voting, they're almost universally the more motivated ones. You can see this sort of thing in Trump's turnout in all 3 of his elections. He is uniquely good at motivating low-propensity voters in a way that none of his competition, either within his party for the primaries or with the Democrats and the generals, have been as good at, because they're just inherently more moderate, and moderates aren't as likely to get up off the couch and vote for the status quo. If you believe society is broken, you're a lot more willing to jump through hoops to try and fix it than someone who thinks it's mostly working out all right as is. Or if you do believe the system is broken, but you don't believe anyone on the ballot is going to try and fix things anyways. Your options are someone who breaks it for the worse and someone who keeps it in the bad state it's in. And that's not really super appealing. And a lot of the old biases still come in here. Look at the topics that won in 2025, Elite Beat Agents, The Culling, Process of Elimination, Buried Stars, I the Somnium Files, Psycho Sleuth, all games that I wanted to talk about but wanted to have a justification for. Typically, if there's a topic that I really want to make a video on, I'll just make it myself and not leave it up to the members. But if it's an oddball topic like those ones, I'll typically throw it into the polls just to try and justify the outcome a bit more. Oh, I didn't choose to talk about this. My community did, so I'm just doing what they want from me. I don't always win the gamble, to be clear. Drag Race and the Death of Competition and What's in a Performance Metric were both topics that I had really hoped would win that just kind of didn't. Honestly, I'm still surprised the Drag Race one didn't. I really thought that was a no-brainer with my community. Apparently I gambled too hard on the gays. And the problem there is, if I want to honor the members' choices and the poll itself and make it worth it for people to participate, I can't just pick up an eliminated topic for myself. If they reject it, I kind of have this approach that it can only be brought back by members, the community, or donors in a donathon. I feel like in order for it to be fair and make sure members feel like their vote matters, I can't veto their choice unless I have a genuinely valid reason for it. For example, the recent How Sombra Ruined Overwatch's Story topic was introduced in February, and then halfway through the voting period, Overwatch went and did a really fun, cool thing where they totally overhauled fucking everything in a way that not only changed a lot of what the video would be talking about, but also how time-sensitive the topic is. As a result, I ended up removing that one from the polls and deciding to just make it myself, and then replaced it with the drag race and the death of competition topic from earlier for reasons that I'll explain in a bit. This is literally the only time I've done something like this with all of my polls. Like, dozens and dozens of topics have been introduced. Plenty have been eliminated that I would have liked to bring back, or, videos that I would have liked to make a lot earlier than they eventually got picked, like the Buried Stars social media toxicity one. But like, I stick with it. And it's only really because of very unique circumstances that I think are fairly understandable that I made a change here. Like, to me, it's the equivalent of if I had put a topic about Danganronpa 2 in the polls, and then halfway through voting, Kodaka announced Danganronpa 2x2. Like, I'd probably do the same thing just because that really fucks everything up, not just for me, but for the voters. Like, they were making decisions based on an entirely different set of facts, a different context. And this puts more impetus on them to vote for it differently in the future in a way that I just kind of don't really want my members' choice polls to be. Getting back on topic though, ranked voting makes it a lot harder to split the vote among Overwatch topics the way I once did. The best I can do is limit the total number of Overwatch options in the hopes that the entire Overwatch voter base won't rally around it right at the start, like what happened with that Sombra topic. Or alternatively, make the Overwatch topics more ambiguous. Making a mascot ruining a character and what it means to hate a game for content were both kind of about Overwatch, but the titles and thumbnails sort of obscured that fact. And that also means I'm not restricted to just invoking Overwatch if I want to make them. And on the flip side, now that I want to make more Overwatch content, I can kind of reverse engineer that. I can try and find, topics that are going to split the vote amongst themselves and then put an Overwatch topic in there. Do I really want to talk about Mizuki? Well, let's see what it'll go up against if I put it in the poll this month. But I mean, thankfully, it rarely gets to that point where I even have to consider resurrecting a topic. I can count the number of times I've been frustrated with my members' voting choices on one hand with fingers to spare. And part of that is the last way I get to rig these votes. Namely, aside from, selecting the topics they get to choose between, I self-select for voters. My community at large is frequently misaligned with my membership. Just look at which topics would have been picked if it was up to the Horde vote versus the membership vote. And that's because my membership isn't really reflective of my overall audience. I have somewhere between 35 and 36,000 subscribers right now. I don't know exactly how it might have changed since I recorded this, and only about 40 people are paying channel members in a given month. And out of them, only about 20 typically actually vote in a given month. Honestly, sometimes I kind of worry that one of them might have died and their membership is just perpetually renewing and I end up feeling kind of bad about it. But that's not the point right now. The point is that the barrier I've placed in front of voting, namely a $5 price tag and then having to fill out a Google form, already does a surprising amount of work filtering for only the people most invested in my content and the topics I'm offering them. That means they're also usually members of my live streaming audience, either on Twitch or on YouTube in the form of the VODs channel. And if that's the case, they're more likely to have a more broadly similar mindset to me. Same with being part of the Discord server, following me on Twitter, following me on Blue Sky, whatever else, They're more likely to be more invested in what I've been playing and what I've been thinking about and talking about. And in the case of games like Buried Stars or Your Turn to Die, they're pretty likely to also want to hear more about my thoughts about those games if they've been watching me play them for hours and hours and hours. And what's more, by making games like Overwatch a smaller part of my streaming life, it has kind of had the effect of deprioritizing them for that audience as well. So that's the basic of how I've rigged the most consistent vote that I hold. I was splitting the vote, I was setting up a voting system that protected my favorites from the worst outcome, and I created the conditions to push my audience towards the topics I wanted them to choose because they were the videos I wanted to make but needed them to be the ones to decide I had to make so that I could justify branching out further and further. And before anyone gets too upset with me, don't forget that it's not like this has just led to some terrible outcomes. A lot of the most popular videos on this channel are ones the members picked, like the Magic and Overwatch one, or the Your Turn to Die one, or the Queer Rep and Overwatch one, or the Omnix or Shallow Storytelling one, or the V3 one. Hell, the only reason the Inescapable one wasn't also a member's choice one is that I kind of already had my topics picked for that one, and also I had a vendetta that I needed to work out on my own and didn't want to have to wait for membership to vote on it. And it's not like my members didn't get to democratically express their own interests. I counted every vote fairly and equally. I notified all members based on their communication preferences, and I have gone out of my way to make sure that the options are presented equally and fairly. Even when it comes to how the topics are ordered, it's always in the same order to avoid bias. The returnee from the last topic is always the first one, then the one from the poll before that is second, and the one from 3 polls ago is the third one. And the fourth slot is always a new topic. If there's an extra slot because the topic got eliminated, then everything gets bumped up and the new topics still fill from the bottom up. Every time I present an option to the members or to the general public, I give them the exact same description of that topic. I don't change it up from month to month or poll to poll. I've stopped showing people how others have voted or how close a topic is to being eliminated because I don't want that to skew the voting unfairly. And I mean, sure, it works in my favor, but just because it's a system that favors me doesn't make it an unfair system, does it? Well, let's see how these things worked out in a different kind of vote. Part 2. The community votes. There are a few ways that non-members get to influence my content. Typically, the top donor in a donathon gets to unilaterally pick a video topic for me to make, which in the past has included these ones up here, with the second and third highest donors getting to pick topics to add to the polls, which you can see here. The way those ones work is that I give them all a full list of all the topics I've brainstormed along with a quick summary and let them just pick one. Or they can come up with one of their own. That part's genuinely not about manipulating people or anything. I'm not trying to get them to pick a specific topic to make. It's just because asking a random person to come up with a full coherent video topic is sometimes putting them a little bit on the spot. So I'd like to make it a little bit easier for them by giving them something to start with, All the topics that have been chosen this way have eventually gotten picked, except for why realistic graphics are never quite right, which is still up for selection in the March poll that started the day this video came out. I also usually give away the ability to revive a topic that was previously eliminated and add it back into the polls, which so far has been used twice with these two topics. Both times it resulted in the previously eliminated topic instantly winning, which is interesting because usually they don't do very well the first go round. I also sometimes give away a bonus vote in the polls, which so far has only been used twice, I think, and both times it failed to influence the outcome. However, those are all also paywalled, which necessarily is a self-selecting process. Being the top donor typically involves donating at least $100 during a month-long donation window, and sometimes substantially more. Top 3 is usually at least $75 US, but it can also be a fair bit higher depending on, who has some extra money that month. Lately, I've started allowing my community to vote collectively in members' choice polls, like I said, but even then they're typically not make or break. The one time I have allowed my community to just vote for future content outright was as a donathon reward back in November. Community members got to vote in 3 separate polls, as mentioned earlier. One to decide a future video topic, one to revive an old dead topic, and one to pick 3 emotes for the channel. And we're going to go through these in reverse order because I think that's a more fun way to approach this, and also allows me to show how we get increasingly rigged as we go along. Part 2.1. The community votes emote vote. So, with the emotes, I'll be upfront and say I didn't really care what people picked. I got to select the candidates and I was happy with all of them, but I still wanted people to feel like they got a say in the outcome. So what happened was that we did what's called single transferable voting, a ranked voting system in which there are multiple winners. Everyone gets to cast a ranked ballot, and the number of votes needed to win is equal to the total number of votes cast divided by 1 plus however many total winners there are. Then you need to add 1 more to whatever number that is. That's called the droop quota, although there are other ways to calculate a winner that I didn't use here. In general, this is a relatively rarely used system because it can quickly get extremely complicated and the nuances of how you handle excess votes can be tricky, but it is still used in places like Australia for Senate elections, where it's a big factor in why so many weird fringe one-off vanity parties actually make it into the Senate. For the emote vote, there were 71 votes cast and 3 winners, so we ended up with a quota of 19. We count up all the first preference votes, and if nothing hits that threshold, then the topic with the fewest votes gets eliminated, and any votes for it go to the second preferences. If nothing's hit the threshold yet, then we repeat until something does. If it hits exactly the threshold, then that's fine, but if not, we have to calculate how we're going to equally split the preferences of the voters that, voted for that option to ensure that it's fair. This is complicated, but thankfully not super necessary for us here. The only real difference from a real election for me, in terms of how I put this together, was that I was also measuring preference for all my ranked voting systems here, with a first preference vote being worth 5 points, second being worth 4, and so on. If there were multiple options with the same number of votes that were up for elimination, I would eliminate them one at a time from lowest preference to highest preference. Since I felt like with so many options and a relatively small voter base, this was kind of necessary to, make it a bit more interesting and actually reflect how people felt. While some single transferable vote systems allow you to rank as many candidates as you want, I limited mine to 5. This means that if all 5 of someone's picks were eliminated, their vote was treated as an expired vote. Same happens in any ranked voting system where you don't have to rank every single option. If you run out of options you don't like, you don't have to keep ranking them, unless there is a minimum number of candidates you have to vote for. And if they all get eliminated, then your vote expires and no longer contributes to any candidate. Anyways, so when it came to the actual vote here, the winning emotes were Dead, Smushed, and Terror, or at least that's how I described them. These 3 were not the ones with the most first preference votes, to be clear. Terror only had 4, whereas Shrug had 7, and 4K and iPop both had 6. However, these were the 3 with the highest overall preference, so eventually over the rounds the votes all filtered up to them. Dead was the first to hit the quota, but thanks to votes expiring, no other emotes did. Instead, we just kept eliminating options until we're left with as many winners as we need. Being perfectly frank, I didn't really care what won here, like I said, but I thought it'd be a good excuse to roll out single transferable voting and explain it a bit. However, this system is vulnerable to rigging in one key aspect. How do you handle excess votes and the threshold for victory? Do you measure everyone who voted for that topic's next preference and redistribute excess votes based on what percentage supported each subsequent candidate? Or do you only split the excess votes based on the preferences of those voters themselves who, whose excess votes got moved over there, you know what I mean? Single transferable voting is also frequently used in partisan systems, and in the Australian Senate races there are actually 2 ways to vote. You can either rank individual candidates, in which case you need to rank a minimum of 12 for your vote to count, or you can rank the parties as a whole, and then your vote will be allocated in order of which candidate the party would prefer. For example, if there are 6 seats up for grabs, Labour can put up 6 candidates in that same race, and they'll rank them themselves 1 through 6 on the ballot sheet. If you rank Labour as your number 1 party vote, then you'll be counted first for Labour's number 1 ranked candidate. If that candidate either wins or gets eliminated and your vote ends up being transferred, your vote would move to the number 2 Labour candidate if they're still in the race, and so on and so forth. If all the Labour candidates got eliminated and your vote was still up to be transferred, then it would move to the highest ranking surviving member from the party you ranked as your number 2, and then it would continue from there. You have to rank at least 6 parties if you choose to vote this way, though. And a weakness of single transferable voting is that it creates an unwieldy number of candidates to sort between. For example, in the 2025 election, voters in New South Wales were presented with 56 options for senators to fill 6 seats across 18 parties plus 3 ungrouped candidates. Australia's system is trying to accommodate this by allowing for party voting instead of having to vote individually, but the argument could be made that putting party voting at the forefront puts too much power in the hands of the parties. Party voting is also a big part of electoral systems like the mixed member proportional one used in Germany and New Zealand, where voters cast 1 vote for a member of parliament for their constituency as well as 1 party vote that's used to determine what proportion of seats the party will get. In the Canadian and British parliamentary systems, where we just do the first part of that and not the second part, it is very common for a party's share of the vote to not align remotely with their share of power. For example, in 2019 and 2021, the Conservative Party of Canada won the most votes. Not a majority, but a plurality, but not the most seats, owing to very poor voter efficiency. Likewise, the Green Party and New Democratic Party are almost always woefully underrepresented. The Greens typically only get 1 or 2 seats, less than 1% of parliament, in spite of typically getting anywhere from 4 to 7% of the vote, while the NDP often get like half the seats they should be getting in a proportional system. In New Zealand and Germany, you vote for your MP, then your party vote determines how many additional MPs each party needs to match their share of the party vote. It can actually end up in a situation where sometimes you elect too many direct MPs for a party compared to how much their proportional vote should entitle them to, and so other parties get top-up seats so they can have extra people so it can balance it out again. Anyways, that's all a tangent. I'm a nerd about electoral systems, that's probably clear by now, and if there had been a way to incorporate mixed member proportional into this video and this voting system, I would have done it. Moving on though, we have to get to the ones that are actually a bit more structurally rigged. Part 2.2, the community votes resurrection vote. Alright, so now we're on to the resurrection vote, which I ran as a 2-round runoff vote, which astute viewers might remember from earlier on in the video. All voters got to cast 1 vote for their favorite topic here, and then if nothing got a majority of the vote, the top 2 would go to a runoff, similar to how I ran old members' choice polls. I had internally set a threshold of 15% for extra topics to go through, so if more than 2 topics cleared that number, then there would have been more topics in that final round, but thankfully we didn't have to worry about that. See, 2-round runoffs are vulnerable to the same issues as first past the post voting. Namely, it's really easy to split the vote, and if you want to manipulate these systems, you just need to run candidates that can sabotage the movement. In countries like France that use it, similar parties that don't want to sabotage each other will form alliances or blocs to collaborate and avoid handing the win to other parties. In this scenario, I couldn't control for candidates actively because I had to pull from my existing list of eliminated topics, but thankfully, Past Me had set the stage for this one perfectly. The issues with 2-round voting in the old members' choice polls meant that a disproportionate number of the topics were Overwatch focused, which allows me to prove my point here. See, the top 2 ended up being Why Video Games Struggle to Get Mysteries Right with 34 out of 84 votes, and Drag Race and the Death of Competition with 15 out of 84 votes itself. Third place was What's the Price of a Game at 6 votes, and outside of the Content Creator Crisis of the Commons with 4 votes, the remaining topics were all Overwatch ones with no more than 5 votes each. The top 2 moved on to the final round, where 38 out of 50 people voted for the Mysteries topic and 12 out of 50 voted for the Drag Race topic, with 34 first-round voters choosing not to participate in the second round. In theory, the takeaway is obvious here. There's a preference among my community members for non-Overwatch topics. The non-Overwatch topics nearly universally performed better than the Overwatch ones, after all. However, in practice, this misrepresents overall preferences. Collectively, 24 people voted for explicitly Overwatch topics, which meant that they were actually a much larger block than the Drag Race voters. However, the Overwatch voters were split, so none of their topics made it to the second round. Many of them actually just didn't vote in the second round because no topic related to what they wanted had made it that far. And to be clear, the Mysteries topic was basically guaranteed to win no matter what at this point, so it didn't really change the final outcome, I don't think, but it definitely changed which topic got second, which in turn is the justification I've used for replacing the Somber topic with it in the upcoming April poll. In this sense, ironically, Drag Race is kind of the equivalent of a far-right party or politician like the Rassemblement National or Marine Le Pen in France. It is the most radically different option that appeals to a relatively small fringe portion of the voter base, but since the kinds of people that would support it have virtually no other option that they'd consider as equally viable that could siphon their votes, and they tend to be very motivated, it had very strong voter efficiency and overperforms relative to the overall voter base's preferences. In politics, this happens because the right is just kind of easier to pull together. Conservatives want the world to go back to some point in history when things were great, most literally embodied in the Make America Great Again slogan, whereas centrists generally prefer the status quo but with some tweaks. Liberals, for the record, are centrists in a liberal democracy. Their ideological framework is the one that's being centered, and both right-wingers and left-wingers are pulling away from that in different directions. Leftists, by contrast, are in an unenviable position of looking to the future, to not maintain the status quo and not to go back to a mythologized past, but to try and invent a radically different future for ourselves. And that kind of means some diversity of opinion on priorities and worldview that all get lumped together into the left, but which are frequently very much so at odds with each other. Not to dramatically oversimplify things here, but Green parties will prioritize environmentalism, Labor parties and socialists will prioritize workers and labor, social progressives will prioritize social justice, not a derogatory term to be clear, at least not in this context, and so on and so forth. Even when there aren't literally multiple parties competing for varying visions of the left, the voters of the left will still prioritize things differently, and that can often make them seem less popular than they actually are. This is not helped by the truest tradition for the leftists of infighting, but that's neither here nor there on this topic. Anyways, the point is, in French elections we frequently see something similar play out to this vote. The left, represented in this scenario by Overwatch, is often fractured and so fails to make advances even if it does collectively have a great deal of support, whereas the RN, Drag Race in this analogy, and Ensemble, the centrist party of Emmanuel Macron and kind of the stand-in for the mysteries topic here, which is, I think the most moderate, neutral one of the bunch, tend to be the ones that do best because they have relatively less competition for the same core voter base and are easier to unify. This is also why it's really stupid in countries like Canada that don't really have a proliferation of leftist parties for the one party that's supposed to be left-wing, the NDP, to keep skewing to the right. The center-left is kind of where the average person tends to sit in this country, so it also ends up being the one with the most competition, and there's no good reason to just deliberately sabotage yourself by invoking that competition for yourself. This is a tangent, but I hope you get what the point is here. Namely, that any sort of one-person, one-vote system is inherently vulnerable to vote splitting, and that this sort of thing tends to disproportionately affect the center-left, and that you can deliberately manipulate this by running spoiler candidates that appear ideologically aligned with your opponent who don't expect to win, but do hope to siphon enough votes to help you win. If I wanted to fuck over more topics, I could just keep adding more and more Overwatch ones to the list. It would have diluted their voting even more. Or if I really wanted to fuck things up, I could have added something similar to the mysteries topic, something else that invoked maybe, I don't know, Disco Elysium, because that was kind of the sort of initial premise of that one. But I didn't. And the candidates that were there kind of created the situation that we had, the outcomes that we had. Another major issue with this approach is polarization. By definition, two-round voting is meant to be polarized. It rewards candidates who have the highest voter efficiency in a crowded field. And the best example of that is probably Peru. Peruvian presidential elections are also two-round elections, and they run a lot of candidates. 18 to be specific in the last one. The top two of that race, Pedro Castillo of Free Peru and Keiko Fujimori of the Popular Force and also daughter of fascist dictator Alberto Fujimori, represented the far left and far right in that election, with Castillo barely winning and centrists being entirely shut out of the second round. In this vote, instead of getting to choose between the mysteries topic and an Overwatch topic, which would have likely represented the actual proportionate preferences of the group, they were asked to choose between two polarized topics when there was really no compromise option. And to be clear, that doesn't mean that the compromise option is inherently better, either in politics or in voting. Centrism is not inherently more valid because it is more moderate or because it makes compromises, and it's not even like it inherently is where the average voter sits. Especially because, just like the leftists, centrists can still have ideological differences that do matter to them. Who's to say that just because all those people voted for an Overwatch topic means that they all would have preferred every single Overwatch topic over any of the non-Overwatch ones? There was still a fair bit of diversity in terms of what kinds of Overwatch topics were offered, and it's entirely possible that lots of them would have put a non-Overwatch topic as a second, third, or fourth preference if given the choice. We can't just assume that just because candidates within that broad spectrum collectively had a significant share of the vote, that all of those voters collectively identified with that entire spectrum over everything else. People's politics, and their entertainment preferences in this situation, are more messy than that. So we've talked enough about that vote at this point, I think, and I assume that you get the point by now. So let's move on to the final vote, the ranked vote for the video topic that got put out yesterday. Part 2.3, the community votes, video vote. At this point, you're probably broadly of the opinion that ranked ballots are just kind of inherently more fair, and to a large extent, they frankly are. They allow you to express your preference for the party or candidate closest to what you want, even if you're fairly certain it won't do well without the fear of it causing a split vote that elevates a candidate that you don't like in the process. If you're a leftist who prioritizes the environment, you can vote green as your first preference but throw the NDP down as the second choice and then liberals third if you're an anything but conservative ABC voter. A movement which has basically exclusively existed to tell NDP and green supporters to strategically vote liberal. Something which you can tell because liberals will gladly split the vote to let a conservative win if they are the ones in the third place position. If you're somebody who likes the videos about visual novels and killing games, you can choose to put either the 100 line or the 0-time dilemma topic as your number one without worrying that it means you'll unintentionally get a non-visual novel topic made. The topics represented a pretty huge range of options as well, something that a ranked vote accommodates much better than any other one voter, one vote system. There were topics related to discussions of games as art, visual novels, battle royales, Overwatch, graphics, capitalism, communication, city builders, and so much more. And voters were allowed to vote not just based on those overarching topics, but on the specifics of each option. And I will say it was genuinely very helpful for me to be able to see how a lot of you felt about stuff, and what the people who liked one topic tended to go towards as their second choice. That sort of thing legitimately does help me with planning future content, even for topics that didn't get picked. However, while ranked voting in theory is a lot less riggable, the reality is that it is still vulnerable. It's just that instead of being structurally rigged, it's a lot more personally rigged, I guess? It's rigged by manipulating specifically how people handle decision making, is what I mean. For one, people tend to have a few key biases that are easy to work with, namely primacy bias and recency bias. Primacy bias means a bias in favor of the first option or the first few options that you were presented with, whereas recency bias is a bias in favor of the thing you were most recently exposed to. When it comes to this sort of voting system with this many candidates, it becomes information overload, and people tend towards the topics that are the first ones they hear or the last ones they hear because that's what they can remember after it's all said and done. You know, the middle topics kind of get lost in the shuffle of all that. This is not a hard and fast rule, to be clear. It's just a bias that skews things. Out of 28 topics, 3 of the top 5 came from the first 8 options on the ballot, while 1 came from the bottom 8. Only 1 topic made it into the top 5 out of those 12 middle topics. And what's more, the middle topics that performed well typically only did so because of the weird way that I was counting preferences, where I eliminated topics one at a time even if they had the same vote count at the beginning of a round. If I hadn't done that, we would have seen even fewer of those middle topics get far. I gave all the topics a character to represent them in tallying the votes based on their ballot position, meaning, first topic was A, second was B, and so on. And you can see the bias play out in the results with B being first, A being second, H being third, U being fourth, and N being fifth. Again, it's not a hard and fast rule, but it does skew things. The 0-time dilemma topic was the H topic, and I'd bet the house on it being the winner if it had been the second topic and the 100-line topic had been the 8th one. However, I like the 100-line and really wanted an excuse to talk about it, so it got placed right near the very top above any other visual novel topics. I even made sure that the topic behind it, why is there no national esport, was the topic I thought was least likely to be appealing to my audience based on the historic weak performance of other esports related videos to further highlight it. And I was right there. Literally nobody picked that topic as their first preference vote. I thought that putting the 100-line topic in the very first slot would look too obvious though, so I picked a random topic that I thought no one really wanted, like there was no hope for it, and just put it there instead. That was the "Is ludonarrative dissonance what makes games not art?" A topic which I have never teased before, and which I don't think anyone at any point was like, man, that topic sounds so good, I hope it wins. People said that sort of thing about the 100-line topic, but not the ludonarrative dissonance one, even though it very nearly won. Why? Well, because of another important bias to remember, laziness bias. I don't actually think that's a real bias, but I can't be bothered to go figure out what it actually would be. A lot of people don't actually fill out their full ballot in ranked ballots. While sometimes that is genuinely an expression of running out of candidates that you feel are worth your vote, sometimes it's just out of pure laziness of not caring to figure out who all these other people are when there's dozens of them and trying to rank them all against each other. Only 13 voters in my poll actually ranked every single topic. By contrast, 14 picked 5 or fewer options. Alternatively, a lot of voters will pick out the handful of topics they do want, then just randomly fill out the rest of their ballot. And while you can't identify pure randomness from these results, you can identify when people started just going from A to Z and filling them out in order. A huge amount of voters have a significant portion of their rankings in alphabetical order. Even if it's not perfect alphabetical order because they picked out some favorites or least favorites and shuffled them to the front or back, but enough that it still reflects that a lot of people were kind of just giving up and filling it out based on the order that they were presented with after a certain point. And that sort of thing is where you can rig the system. And politicians and parties know this. In any electoral system, there are huge fights about which party and which candidate gets to appear first on the ballot in any electoral system because there's a huge advantage to being the one on top. There's an inherent bias in favor of the option on top because we associate it with being higher ranked or higher preference, and vice versa for the options on the bottom, which seem almost like afterthoughts. Beyond the subconscious bias, we also just have that laziness, like I mentioned. If you're lazy, you're more likely to run out of steam the further along you get and just stop picking options if you aren't required to vote for everything. And if you are required to vote for a certain number of options, there's a good chance you'll just start filling in options by ranking things from the top until you hit the minimum. Even if you don't have to, a lot of people will still do that because they feel like they need to pick every option that's available. If you do genuinely evaluate the whole ballot, the top of the ballot and the bottom of the ballot are the ones that are most likely to stick in your mind. But that middle area is a real no man's land. And again, to be clear, this bias very much so favors first rather than last, but it goes sort of first, last, middle, I guess is the way you'd organize that. Ballots tend to be organized in a few different ways. In Canada, they go alphabetically by candidate last name for most elections, which, as someone who has run for office several times and has a last name pretty close to the end of the alphabet and has seen almost every single winner come from the first half of the alphabet in every single election he's run in, is pretty annoying, actually. There's an inherent bias towards people with last names that start earlier in the alphabet because they get put first. It's not because they're the better candidates necessarily. Having a last name that starts with A doesn't magically make you a better politician or something than someone whose last name starts with Z, but you get put at the top of the list and they don't. Other election systems will rank them based on things like the party names of the candidates, or will put more successful parties closer to the front. In some places like New York, there's something called fusion voting, where candidates are allowed to appear multiple times on the ballot under different party names. This is useful if you're operating in a system that randomizes the placement of the candidates on each ballot to make sure that everyone is in an equal position, equal number of times. Something that, makes the counting take a lot longer, but in theory will balance out that laziness or that bias based on position. And being on multiple party lines means that you're also increasing your odds of getting a top spot. My choice to not randomize the voting here is an effort to twist those biases in my favor. There was no real rhyme or reason to justify the positioning of the topics, at least not a fair one, because I didn't want it to be fully fair. I had topics I preferred, and I had topics I felt less strongly about, and I set it up to try and reflect that. And it worked. I got the outcome I wanted. I also got a good insight into what kind of topics people tended to lean towards, and it did serve a bigger purpose of making sure I understood what people preferred and, all that stuff. But even then, I was already asking a lot of people. Ask people to fill out the form for 1 to 28 topics, then to go vote for one of 15 topics to get resurrected, and then ask them to pick their top 5 emote ideas out of 20. A lot of people, even with the incentive of getting entered into a raffle to win a Wiggler pin, simply just did not give a shit by the time they got through reading all that information. They did it because they wanted the pin or because they had a couple topics they cared about, but a ton of people just straight up did not participate in the emote vote or the second round vote because it asked too much of them. And again, this is definitionally the most committed part of my audience in terms of being willing to put in the time and effort to go fill out this form. By design, the only people who would fill it out in the first place are the ones who are most invested in what I do. And as has been established, that has historically never been my Overwatch audience. I made voting into a chore to make sure that I only got the kinds of people who pick the other kinds of topics. That is also something done in real-world elections. The most obvious examples are things like explicit voter suppression policies like the absurd literacy test that the US used to use to disenfranchise black voters, but there are also more implicit ways of doing this. If your country doesn't make Election Day a holiday, then that means you're trying to get people in when they're already likely tired from a full workday. No early voting means that everyone has to try and get there on the same day, increasing wait times and making it more likely to conflict with something else for working class voters or parents or people with disabilities who can't spend the whole day sitting outdoors in, hypothetically, fucking November. No mail-in voting disenfranchises disabled, rural, and remote voters. Voter ID policies restrict a lot of eligible voters because a shocking number of people genuinely do not maintain consistent ID, especially when it costs money to do so or when multiple pieces of ID are required. And also just means anyone who lost their wallet's fucked. In Australia, where voting is mandatory, elections are always on Saturdays, and it's really common there for there to be charities and fundraisers nearby that try and sweeten the deal for voters with democracy sausages, hot dogs on white bread that you get after voting. By contrast, in the US, it's typically illegal to hand out water to voters who are in line in at least some states because they can construe it as trying to influence voters with a gift. And that's the argument anyways. And you can kind of see this in my own polls too, in fact. Ever since I started doing the Horde vote, I have consistently had well over 1,000 people participate in the voting each month, typically between 1,200 and 1,800, with some going over 2,000. This is actually kind of important for our purposes because it does establish there are a lot of people who are willing to vote for a future video topic and are interested in getting a voice in the direction of my channel if the barrier to participation is as low as possible. There's no authentication or anything required. They don't have to type anything in. They don't have to manually rank a bunch of topics. They don't have to follow up later. They don't have to give me any money. They just pick their preferred topic and move on. But then you look at what barriers do stop people from voting. In any given member's choice poll, there are usually about only 15 to 25 members who vote. That means that the combined barriers of a $5 price tag and needing to go to a separate platform to vote filter out literally almost 99% of all people who've demonstrated an interest in voting in these exact same polls. If we remove the price barrier and introduce an actual reward for doing so, entry into a raffle for a Wiggler pin, then we see participation jump up to 84 people, even for a poll that is significantly more complicated and involved than the others are. And that, I think, is a good time to go into our final part of this topic. Part 3. Every election is, at least a little bit, rigged. So the fact of the matter is that no matter how perfectly you try to run your democracy, it is impossible for it to be purely, truly fair. It is impossible to remove bias from the equation, and given that a key component of democracy is that it is governance with the consent of the people, that means you have to grapple with the unpredictability and variability of the general public. We are stupid and bad at many things, and nobody is as educated and informed on politics as they should be. A lot of people have bad ideas, bad ideologies, bad values, bad priorities, and bad practices. And under democracy, we have to let them decide regardless. Now, something I should disclose here is that I did not, in fact, plan all this out from the beginning. The idea for a video about voting systems bounced around for a long time for me because I am a nerd about it, as this video has probably demonstrated, but at no point did I ever actually make an attempt to rig things. I didn't pick voting systems based on how likely they were to give me the outcomes I wanted, and I didn't try and introduce topics specifically to win polls or sabotage other topics or whatever else. Sometimes I did introduce kind of a filler topic, but that was more out of being overwhelmed and not having the time to always lovingly handcraft every single topic for weeks on end, especially back when there were 5 per poll. Sometimes I got to the end of the month and just kind of had to throw something together. Likewise, I frequently did have favorite topics. Like, there definitely were some that I liked more than others and really wanted to win, but like, that wasn't really about trying to rig it. I only really decided to make this video when it came time to figure out how to handle all the voting for the Community Choice Donathon rewards, and I decided that part of how I'd make this argument was by framing it around riggery. Again, some stuff has definitely been me putting a thumb on the scale. I have in the past talked about topics I would hope would win, and I usually have a good idea of what will win, but like, if I was rigging things, I would do a better job. Videos like the V3 video, the process elimination video, and the buried stars social media toxicity video were all ones I really wanted to get picked, and I did put my finger on the scale for them a fair bit, but they all almost got eliminated when they finally eventually got picked. The drag race and performance metric topics both got eliminated even when I really did want them to win. When it came to the community vote, I basically just wanted to use a different electoral system for each one and just pick them based on what would be the most accommodating for what we were trying to do there. Again, I definitely did want that 100-line topic to win, but if I'm being honest, I thought the zero-time dilemma one would win. That one has been a topic I've talked about for years at this point, and I've kind of hyped up over time, and especially with the Inescapable video, it was kind of a part of that, so I thought it would do better. And I definitely did not expect that ludonarrative dissonance one would do so well, but regardless, very little of it was actually like managed or manually arranged or choreographed or whatever. I just had a Google Doc with my brainstorming list of topics, and they were presented in the order that I had them on there, and while I did deliberately move the 100 line up higher, basically everything else was just kind of where it was, like sort of in the order that I came up with them. For the resurrection vote, they were ordered based on the order of elimination. For the emote one, it was just random. I don't think I had any purpose behind that one. For members' choice polls, it's always based on how recently they've appeared, with new topics always being at the bottom. In fact, I kind of initially did it that way because I thought it would balance out the recency bias of a new topic being introduced with the primacy bias that would favor earlier topics. However, some of this stuff is also just incidental. Obviously, when it comes to members' choice polls, the topics that are most likely to win are the ones in the first and final positions. The one in the first position is the one that took second in the previous poll, which means it was already provably popular. And the one in the final position is always a brand new topic, which means that it's frequently the most topical or the most fresh. Meanwhile, the ones in the second and third positions are usually ones that placed third or fourth in a previous poll, sometimes several times in a row across the span of months. It makes sense that a topic that was unpopular before will be unpopular again, especially now that the voting is ranked, so it's a little bit more indicative of where people's preferences actually fall. For the community video vote, there was actually a pretty wide range of support, and people mostly went based on related topics. People who voted for the 100-line video almost always had the zero-time dilemma topic ranked right after it, or vice versa. Whereas people who voted for topics related to Overwatch or monetization or whatever else also typically voted for related topics regardless of where they were scattered. There was still a bias towards the front and the back, but it's important to acknowledge that the 3 topics that didn't get any votes, the ones labeled C, P, and W, came from all over, obviously. One from the first state, one from the last state, one from the middle. When it came to the resurrection vote, I genuinely had no clue which topic would win. Both of the final 2 were wildly unpopular when they first appeared, and they never placed higher than third. But, then in this vote, the mystery one just blew up, and then immediately won the first poll it reappeared in. And I am very curious about what's going to happen with that drag race one now that that's coming back too. The emote vote was, again, kind of just whatever, but still. You might be wondering why I chose to frame this entire video as if I rigged these votes then. After all, if someone only watched the first half hour of this video or whatever, which fair, it's a long video, they might think less of me and my practices. In fact, they almost certainly would. Maybe not by a lot, but, maybe by a little. They might look at me and think that I am duplicitous or dishonest or whatever, when in reality, it was just the framing. I retroactively assigned meaning, motivation, intention, and more to actions that literally just were not there, and in doing so, painted my own democratic processes as being anti-democratic, rigged by an elite, the only elite in this scenario, with control over the system. In reality, I drew a maze around a path I'd already walked and just pretended that every twist and turn had been a deliberate maneuver. And the reason why I did this is to demonstrate why we should be skeptical of accusations of this sort of thing in the real world. To demonstrate how easy it is to twist outcomes and frame practices as duplicitous and malicious when, in reality, they're just kinda inevitably imperfect in order to sow distrust and anger among the voters. To make them feel like their voices are being overridden, manipulated by puppet masters that they need to overthrow. To make people feel like while perfect democracy is possible, their enemies are keeping them from it. And that something has to be done about them. Do we get where we're going yet? The reality of any democratic process is that it is flawed. Of course it is. Democracy is the structure by which we turn the opinions of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions, and hundreds of millions of people into policy. It is the excruciatingly messy process of trying to figure out how to not just decide policy, but decide who gets to decide policy. It is an imperfect filter for the inputs of everyone into singular, actionable outputs. It is important to keep in mind the inherent limitations of any democratic process when it comes to understanding how politicians talk about it, because it is very easy for people who don't like democracy to turn those inherent limitations into some sort of malevolent scheme by their opponents to convince you to vote for them under the guise of protecting the system they're aiming to dismantle. However, on the flip side, it's also important to remember that politicians who benefit from the way particular systems function are not unbiased in their defenses of those systems, and there are systems that are better and worse. The Liberal Party of Canada, after the only election in which it has taken third place in Canadian history, adopted electoral reform as a campaign promise, only to win a majority in the next election and refuse to implement it. Why? Well, because outside of that one 2011 election, thanks Tom Mulcair, eat shit and die, first past the post always helps out the Liberal Party. And inherently, it helps any party in power, or any, polarized party, I guess you could say. Any of the other systems we've discussed here, whether it's instant runoff voting, single transferable voting, mixed member proportional, even two-round runoffs, all are inherently going to negatively impact the parties popular under the first past the post voting system because first past the post disproportionately rewards the already major parties. Canadians haven't given a majority of the vote to any federal party since the 90s and have frequently been below 40% for the winning party, but we've had plenty of majority governments. Hell, the Liberals have lost 2 of the last 4 elections in the popular vote, but still got to form government with the most seats. And at the rate things are going now with the Conservatives defecting to the Liberals, it looks like Carney might actually turn a minority government into a majority post-election. Ranked voting in Canada would benefit the Greens, NDP, and Bloc Québécois significantly, and it would be almost exclusively at the expense of the Liberals. Meanwhile, the Conservatives don't want it because not only would it hurt them if they couldn't benefit from left-wing vote splitting, it would also invite more right-wing parties, fracturing amongst themselves. The Canadian right has a tradition of merging their various parties regardless of ideological difference because their one priority is defeating the Liberals federally or the NDP provincially, and they can argue that splitting the vote will only help the left. Which is true, because conservatism is the minority opinion in Canada by a significant margin. They don't want to allow for competition. 2-round voting would help the Liberals, but to such an extent that absolutely nobody would be willing to let them do it, and it would be deeply stupid. Single transferable voting wouldn't be a bad idea in the cities, but it's such a complicated system that would invite so many candidates to run that it would kind of make those ballots unwieldy. Proportional representation systems are even more helpful to smaller parties because they better represent the broader perspectives of everyone rather than just whoever can get the most votes in any given riding. Partyless proportional representation is a system where you vote for parties, not candidates. Typically, anyways. And the legislature gets split up based on what share of the vote each party got. This system is used in Israel and Poland with a closed list, meaning you only vote for the party who then get to decide who gets to fill the seats they're allocated and in what order. Others, like Sweden or Switzerland, use an open list system where voters get to also indicate their preference for specific candidates from a party, and seats are allocated based on some combination of candidates within the party who meet the quota as well as internal party preference. Others, like New Zealand and Germany, use mixed member proportional, where you get to vote twice, once for your local representative and once for a party. This is, by basically any metric, the most democratic system in terms of allowing for both directly elected representatives to represent your district while also allowing parliament to be formed based on the actual positions of the general public. The only thing you could really do to improve it is to make the local representative vote into a ranked vote instead of first past the post, but I digress. However, these systems aren't without criticism either. Not always good criticism, but still criticism. One advantage proponents will claim first past the post has, and it is one that Justin Trudeau explicitly used to justify keeping it in Canada, is that it keeps radicals and extremists out of power. The People's Party in Canada can't win seats because it's functionally impossible for them to get enough support in any one riding to win, even if they do get a few percentage points each time. But if we had a proportional system, they probably would get a few MPs each election, getting their foot in the door. We see this in Australia with parties like One Nation getting a seat in the Senate a lot of the time, or a seat in various legislatures, because there are enough shitty, racist people who believe in that shithole party to eventually push them through at some point if it's ranked. The objectively correct counter-argument to that is that first past the post just creates the incentive for the extremists to hijack a mainstream party and steer it off a fucking cliff. You could look at the conservative parties in provinces like Alberta or even just Canada federally for examples of it. In Alberta, the far-right Wild Rose Party took over after the merger between them and the centre-right Progressive Conservatives in forming the United Conservatives. Federally, when the far-right Reform Party, renamed the Canadian Alliance, merged with the centre-right Progressive Conservatives, the Reformers were the ones who took control of the new Conservative Party of Canada. Even when there weren't mergers, the far-right has a habit of infiltrating any mainstream centre-right party and dragging it further right, or just outright replacing it. Whether that's in BC with the BC Liberals, renamed BC United before they imploded, or in Ontario with the PCs, or in Saskatchewan with the Saskatchewan Party, or in Quebec with the Coalition Avenir Québec. America is probably the best example of that. Trump's hijacking of the already far-right Republican Party in 2016, dragging that whole party, and the Democrats along with them, to the furthest right they've maybe ever been. And then again, it's not like the accusations against proportional systems don't have a grain of truth to them. The AfD in Germany is a good example of how the system can let the extremists in that otherwise probably wouldn't be able to get there. In theory, that can be countered by everyone refusing to work with them, a concept called accord sanitaire, where all parties agree to not work with a specific party. But in reality, that's only ever lasted until someone might actually need to rely on them for power. In Germany, there's sort of been a de facto accord sanitaire hard blockade against the far right ever since 1945. Fucking wonder why. And that lasted right up until the right-wing CDU needed their vote for a non-binding resolution in 2025. The far-right Sweden Democrats were the subjects of accord sanitaire that ended in 2018 on the local level in Sweden and 2019 on the national level once they were needed to form government by centrists. And ironically, the ones who break and choose to side with the fascists are nearly universally always these same centrists who lament that proportional voting will enable the far right. It was the centrists in Weimar Germany who handed power to the Nazis. It was the moderate power Christian Democrats and liberals in Sweden who brought the Sweden Democrats into government. And it was the centrists in France who drew a hard line in the sand on working with the left-wing Nouveau Front Populaire that they did not draw with the far-right Ralliement National, even though the NFP have held the plurality of seats since the last election. And there are other criticisms of them too. For one, they make majority governments basically impossible, since the general public almost never actually agrees on that sort of thing unless there's literally only two options. This can be a good thing, It can force collaboration rather than polarization, which itself does inherently moderate everyone a bit towards the general public's preferences, but it's not universally a good thing. Lots of proportionally elected governments end up being non-functional, or end up relying on extremists to get those last couple seats to form a functional government and then being dragged back by them, with Israel being the most obvious example of that sort of thing, on both counts in fact. And that does beg the question of what limits, if any, should exist. Are there opinions or positions that shouldn't be allowed to compete? Germany explicitly outlaws neo-Nazis from politics, although their efficacy in actually enforcing that one is a bit of a mixed bag. The cordon sanitaire works right up until someone sees an advantage in breaking it. And if you give the government the power to regulate which parties are ideologically allowed to compete, who's to say that they're going to exercise that in the best interest of the people? If you give Benjamin Netanyahu that power, he is not going to use it to remove the hardline Zionist parties from the equation, that's for fucking sure. Proportionally, there is a sizable chunk of the population of every country who are just straight up Nazis. Not a majority, probably not even a very large percentage a lot of the time, but it's not zero. Every proportional system has a threshold for entering, typically around 5% support before they start getting seats allocated to them, but what happens if at least 5% of the population are really fucking stupid and insane and evil? And that's not a hypothetical, that is kind of just the reality of life. A solid 5%, arguably a lot more of the population, are really fucking bad. Just bad people. What do you do about that? And you might be wondering what the point of this is. Why just point out the flaws in every system? Is there not a good one? What am I trying to say here? And that's the thing. There are good systems. MMP is a good system. Ranked voting is a decent system, whether it's instant runoff voting or a single transferable vote. They're not flawless, but that's kind of the point here. It's important to be knowledgeable about how these systems work so you can identify genuine flaws in them and the pros and cons of various approaches to that impossible question of how do we figure out what everybody wants to do all at the same time so that you can't be swayed by politicians who use these flaws to forward their own anti-democratic interests. Establishment politicians will defend their non-proportional systems because they keep themselves in power, not because it's for the best for everyone else. Political parties of all stripes will advocate for systems that serve them better, and you need to be able to suss out which criticisms and defenses are valid or bullshit. You need to be able to figure out when an accusation of riggery is just trying to weaponize an inherent aspect of the system for personal gain, just as much as you need to be able to figure out when a defense of a system is just being used to keep an anti-democratic system whose only advantage is that it disproportionately benefits the people deploying the argument. The point of this video has been to demonstrate how easily a dishonest, uncharitable framing of an electoral process that is broadly run fairly and equitably and reasonably, but He is still not only capable of producing imperfect outcomes in terms of representing the general public's actual desires, but is functionally guaranteed to do so, can be manufactured and used to undermine the results. How easy it is to weaponize the reality of flawed systems working as intended as the system being manipulated and rigged. Our democratic institutions are under a lot of fire right now around the world, and it's important to be able to discern what's what when it comes to who's acting in good faith, who's acting in bad faith, and who's trying to act in good faith but is being misled by the bad actors into regurgitating bad faith arguments. Democracy is pretty important to a lot of us, and the idea that our voices are being wiped out is one that engenders a lot of animosity in us, and understandably so. But democracies are one of the rare systems capable of self-elimination within their own rules. A politician can use democracy to win elections and then use the power gained from it to end democracy in a way that doesn't really tend to happen under other systems. And that's the biggest risk of all of this. If democracy is something important to us, then we have an obligation to understand how to protect it from itself, like the child with a fork running full speed for the toaster that it currently is. We need to not let our valid frustrations with imperfect methodology and systems make us give power to the people who will obliterate democracy and make it worse under the guise of restoring power to the people. We need to be able to understand which people actually believe in restoring power to the people. It's not conservatives, I'll give you that fucking much. Our role in preserving democracy does not start nor end with the ballot box, to be clear. But insofar as the ballot box is still respected as the means by which our governments derive their authority to govern us, it is important to do everything in our power to ensure that nobody's allowed to use the ballot box's flaws to convince us to let them set it on fire. We need more democracy in the world, not less. Not just in our governments, but in workplaces too. There is nobody on this earth who is acting in their best interest when they advocate for you to lose your voice. And if you want to keep your voice, you need to be able to tell when a leopard is trying to convince you to vote for the leopards eating faces party. And that's where this one's going to end. Thank you very much for watching, and I really hope you've enjoyed this slightly weird video. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you did, or didn't, I'm not your mom. And consider checking out yesterday's video on the 100-line Last Defense Academy if you haven't already. Weirdly enough, that one's actually significantly shorter than this one. As well, if you'd like to participate in some imperfect democracy yourself, you're in luck. The March Members' Choice Poll starts today, and if you get a $5 membership on either YouTube or Patreon from the links in the description, you can also get to vote between these 4 topics. Why social skills actually matter in competitions. This video would explore how social skills work as both offensive and defensive tools in competitive environments, and why that's important. Why realistic graphics are never quite right. This video would be about the problem with realistic graphics, both in terms of why it's a boring artistic decision, as well as why it's always just a little bit wrong. The relatability of flopping. This video would explore how a flop era isn't always the worst thing in the world, how it humanizes people we sometimes see as larger-than-life figures and reminds us that they're human. Mizuki is a good character, you people just can't read. This video would be a defense of Mizuki Kawano from an audience of Overwatch players who seem determined to mischaracterize and misunderstand him at every turn, and would explore the difference between a badly written character versus a character you just don't like. The poll started at midnight today, or I guess this morning, and will run until midnight on March 10th, and all members can vote directly themselves, and the community at large can vote in the Horde vote as well. We are almost all caught up on all of them. The February one will be coming out on the 15th, and I'm hoping the March one will either be out by the end of March or early April. Lastly, thank you very much to all my channel members. At the $25 Elite membership tier, thank you to Adele, Robot Juice, and Bingo Banga. At the $10 Premium membership tier, thank you to Tortoise, Angie Tenark, Javi Corbin, Corey Anders, NJD, and Mooney. At the $5 channel membership tier, thank you to Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Destiny, Cadence, Marsh Alice, Gavos, Crimson Cyclo, CatLover192, Corey, MV, The Only Enigma, Mariah, Meep Cube, Noisy Pitta, Harv, Marcy Gaskill, Deco _ Safan, Lala the Bambi, Teo Tamara, Alinea, Caffeine Jelly, Aiden S, Ismi, 1000 Dumplings, Nilos, Lily Hero, Mitzicore, Bubble Boy, Shy J, and Brian. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or just decided to click on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching. I hope I'll see you around again soon.